Hello everyone and welcome to the beautiful Eternity Playhouse. My name is Carla Trelaw. I'm the Director of the Centre for Social Research in Health. Today we're here to conduct our second annual sex lecture. So a little bit of background to this lecture. Our centre is really fortunate to have as ambassadors for strategic support and the wisest of councils, Michael Kirby and Bill Botel. So Bill wasn't able to join us today, but we do have Michael with us and he'll be doing the opening. And they suggested to us a little over 18 months ago that we should have a sex lecture and really communicate our research with the audience and community. So last year, Professor Martin Holt delivered the first one to great acclaim, and we were so pleased with the success of that we wanted to continue the series and change up the topic a bit. So Christy today will be talking, and we've used some nice brackets, sexuality lecture, particularly about queer families. So Christy is a social researcher of health, sexuality and relationships in our centre. And we'll be talking today across a number of different studies that are going on with a range of different collaborators. Amy Coopes, that will be providing the discussant and response in the afternoon, has a wonderful Twitter bio, and I have to concentrate to get the order right, hack turned quack. So as a journalist, editor, writer, and now a medical student. So we're really pleased to have this range of ideas and responses coming from Amy, and we'll invite you all to participate in that with some roving microphones. We are video recording the session today, and we'll be recording voices in that Q&A afterwards. I'd also like to welcome our speakers' children, Lila and Josie. And you may see a bit more of them in Christy's presentation. And also I noticed some other kids in the audience today. That's terrific. We really do want to speak to a wide range of audiences, and knowing the importance of families in the social debates and commentary in the last little while, it's very important that we talk to all of the families that we want to engage with. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the unintroducible. How do you introduce Michael Kirby? And I have about 3 pages of notes of awards and acclaim and esteem, but it is really such a wonderful relationship to have with you, Michael. The wisest of counsel you've provided to us and the strategic advice and support is truly remarkable, and where you fit us in your enormous global work is, I'm not sure how you do it, but I'm very, very pleased and thankful that you do. So please, Michael.
Thank you very much, Carla Trelaw, and congratulations to you and to everybody who works in the Centre for Social Research in Health. And I think the audience that we've gathered this afternoon vindicates the decision to have an annual sex lecture. And I don't think there should be too much moving away from sex. I mean, sex is a very broad concept, and you don't have to dress it up as sexuality because somehow or other the issues that we are going to be debating today, last time with Martin Holt and in the future, is going to be related to that most fascinating and interesting but debatable subject of sex. I'm very pleased to acknowledge the Indigenous people of our country, to reflect seriously, as the New Zealanders always do, upon the wrongs that have been done to them, like the gay minority. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia suffered and still suffer many wrongs which frequently have their basis in law, and we should therefore reflect upon that and on the common problems each community, the LGBTIQ and Indigenous communities, have suffered at the hands of the law. I also want to acknowledge the brilliant Christy Newman, who's going to deliver the lecture today, She won a university medal and first-class honours at Murdoch University in Western Australia, and she's a brilliant acquisition for the University of New South Wales, and she's working in this most fascinating area of social health research and the issues of sexuality, and she's got a whole life ahead of her, which is going to unravel many of the mysteries that exist in this field. I'm also pleased to see here today Peter Boehm, because it takes my mind back to those very early days of the HIV epidemic, when sex was on many minds, and it was a time of great danger, of great fear, and of a growing realization of the importance of research into health and sexual health in particular that were needed at a moment when there were no drugs, no pills to pop, no easy cures for the new mysterious virus, and when research in health became absolutely central to the Australian response. Our response was one of the best in the world, and that was because of the fact that from the very beginning we started to look at the epidemic in terms of a scientific challenge, and that included a social science challenge. And of course there were people who opposed that at the time, and many were sincere, many were simply politicians and others on both sides of the aisle who had a negative view about research into this area. It's curious, that negative view, but it still exists. But fortunately, there were heroes. That was a moment when really we had great heroes in politics in Australia. And one of them is in the audience today, Peter Boehm. And the other I would name as Neil Blewett, the Federal Minister for Health in the Hawke government, and Peter Boehm on the other side in politics, but they came together and they resolved that they would support research as to what it was and what worked, what didn't work, and that would become a new way of looking at an epidemic which was affected by and centred upon sexual activity. And such debates have gone on ever since, really, in and out of Parliament. And last year we had the postal survey, which was something that I opposed vehemently, because it was being imposed upon the people of Australia as a precondition for the LGBT community to gain simple legal equality, which had already been gained in many countries of the world, but was being held up by those who invented the impediment of a plebiscite. And even though that was twice defeated in the Senate, it nonetheless went ahead in the form of the postal survey. It was intended, fellow citizens, to kill marriage equality, but it didn't. And the people of Australia, much to the surprise, I think, of those who propounded the postal survey, came forward with a vote which essentially was about 60% against 40%. And that vote was the silver lining of a very flawed procedure. I noticed that it's stated here that the objectives of the centre and of this lecture are to tackle intimate, uncomfortable matters frankly, sensitively, and with good humour. And that, of course, put me in mind of the Honourable Barnaby Joyce, because his predicament at the moment does require a degree of confrontation with intimate and uncomfortable matters, frankly, sensitively, and with a degree of humour. But let us, as fellow human beings and citizens, reflect upon the pain that Barnaby Joyce and his partner are going through. I mean, as a human being, I think gay people learn to be very sensitive to people's sexual catastrophes, and they know that life is full of difficult times. Sometimes some people have that. I've had a bit of a dream run myself with meeting a wonderful partner 49 years and 1 week ago, but not everybody has that, and not everybody keeps it, and not everybody really wants it. But it is a painful thing to think of the partner of Mr. Joyce hiding in this place up in Armidale and frightened to go out, and she's expecting a child. I just as a human being, I think most of us would feel for that predicament. On the other hand, it said that public funds have been misused, public office has been misused, and so on. And unfortunately, that just has to be examined and determined according to rules, and that is just how we're not a corrupt society, and we have rules, and people, everybody, be you ever so high, the law is above you, and they have to conform to it. But it has always seemed to me that one aspect of the Barnaby Joyce saga that is in a way to me more important than the public funds, because though that's important, they're not objectively very great, but it is that a man can rise so high to be the Deputy Prime Minister of this continental country and not to see that the predicament he was facing and the pain he was facing and was going to face even more acutely was a pain that he really, to the end, was inflicting upon a section of the community by refusing to acknowledge their integrity and their right to love and their right to sexual intimacy and, if you are lucky, as he kept saying, to children. And so that is, I think, a quandary about Mr. Joyce as a citizen and as a leader of the country, and a very high leader. You only get one step up when you're Deputy Prime Minister of the country, that you would have expected more. And even now you would expect more, that he might say, well, I'm going through this and this has made me concentrate. But he didn't even come into Parliament to vote in the end on the legislation for marriage equality. And he presumably still opposes it. And that is despite what he has gone through and is now going through. So that illustrates that you've got to reflect upon your own life. And when you do, you become much more tolerant of other people's lives and about the catastrophes that they face, because they are just part of being a human being on this planet, and that is just inescapable with human sexuality in particular. I remember that back in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, when Peter Boehm and Neil Blewett were urging that we take steps based on a scientific approach, the shadow minister for the coalition at the time said some really nasty things about gays, and he was attacked at a conference that I attended in Hobart by John Dwyer, the very distinguished professor of medicine, and eventually John Howard, who was then the leader of the Liberal Party, replaced him, and and eventually Peter Boehm became the Shadow Minister, and that led on to the successful strategies that by research and by a foundation in science we followed in Australia. I go tomorrow to England for a conference in England on the HIV and HCV epidemics and injecting drug users. This is another area where social science and research has led us in Australia to do much better, and our levels of HIV in injecting drug users is second only to New Zealand. New Zealand, it's 1%, and in Australia it's 2%. It's very low because we adopted a social science, research-based, factual, evidence-based approach to these issues. And that essentially is the message of the Centre for Social Research in Health, that these are complicated, they're sensitive, there isn't too much humour about it, and the struggles are often very difficult. But that is the way to formulate policy. And unfortunately, the postal survey didn't go down that informed path, and it did a lot of harm and a lot of insult to people, and we're going to hear something about it today. So I congratulate you all for coming along. This will not be an entirely joyful exercise today, but it will be founded in good science. And that was the message we got in the very earliest days of HIV. Not in prejudice, not in mythology, not in medieval demons, but in good science. And that is why this sex lecture is a very good reminder of where we've come from and where we're still going. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be here. I'm proud to be an ambassador for the Centre, and I have much pleasure now in calling, is Christy going to speak now, or do we have any more introduction? Why don't they tell more about your brilliant career? Anyway, Christy Newman.
Thank you so very much, Michael, for that welcome. You have had an incredible impact on the lives of people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities right around the world, changing hearts, minds and laws with the power of both your evidence-based arguments and your own story. We are so very grateful that you continue to dedicate yourself to promoting the work of those of us who are seeking to defend those rights in Australia, particularly in social research, which tries to listen to those communities whose voices are the hardest to hear and the easiest to exclude from mainstream public life and policy. Thank you so much to all of you for coming here today. I should say up front, all of the images, including this one, which is of the High Court, in case you don't know, you should go and visit it. All of these images were taken on my iPhone. So yes, you have signed up for a queer family slideshow today. I have 40 slides for the 40th anniversary. You are going to sit quietly and enjoy it. To start, I want to acknowledge and pay my deepest respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to their elders past, present and emerging. I recognise the strength of our First Nations people in surviving centuries of policies of dispossession and their continuing contribution to the life and the culture of this city and this country. I also want to acknowledge the importance of family to Aboriginal people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, sister girl or brother boy, and the role that so many Aboriginal families have and do play in embracing and celebrating that diversity. There's another group of elders I want to acknowledge, the elders of our queer communities. The battles they fought and the indignities they endured make it possible for me to stand up here and talk about queer families without being arrested, without being heckled, yet, or fearing for the safety of myself and my family. So thinking back on their contributions, on the 40-year anniversary of the first Mardi Gras march, we can see that much has changed. In that year, I was 3 years old. Growing up in Western Australia, descended from 7 generations of Irish and English migrants. My large extended family are a loving, religious and fiercely political tribe of union leaders, teachers, environmental and social activists. But 20 years later, in 1998, when I moved to Sydney to try out new ways of living and loving, my family were completely unprepared. They, like so many families, before and since, had no template, no skills for understanding how to support a family member who was growing into a sexuality which was different from their own. So we went through a very difficult few years, but we did find our way back to each other, which is a very long story told in a very short phrase. Here we are enjoying the last sunset of last year. So it's not hard to see how lucky I've been. I've had the chance to live as I wanted without having to choose between my bisexuality and my family. And now my own children, who have not 2 but 3 mothers, lucky things, are devoted to that family and to the other families they're embedded within. Biological, chosen, global, local, interstate. It keeps going. But for me, as for many others across Australia, the experience of living through the marriage equality debacle made it clear that while much has been achieved in changing attitudes to sexuality, we're not yet done. For every family like mine, who were mostly yes voters and able to celebrate the outcome together, another was ripped in two as a direct result of having been asked to pick a side. For every individual and couple and family who were thrilled to have the opportunity to post their survey in, there was another who was humiliated by the process, or aghast at having to support the right to marry when they didn't actually support the concept of marriage in any form. But I think what affected me most was realising that for every positive representation we saw of inclusive families, those images of queer sons and daughters who were celebrated and loved, there were myths being perpetuated about same-sex families being an unsafe and unnatural environment for children to be raised in. This made it clear to me and to many others that we are still split as a community between those who can see that sexuality is simply one aspect of a person's life with no impact on one's capacity to love well, live well or parent well, and those who can't or won't make room in their hearts for an appreciation of sexual and gender diversity. This needs to change. It's 40 years since the first Mardi Gras march. We have marriage equality now. It's time to finally move on and learn to accept and to celebrate the differences that exist within every one of our communities, including within the diverse forms of families that we make. So in the time I have left, I want to make 3 points about queer families, which are informed by the social research studies that I've been involved with at CSRH, including interviews with a diverse range of LGBTQ people. So my first point is that at this point in history, now that we have marriage equality, I hope we can come to understand that not only are queer families everywhere, they are also more than one thing. When I say queer families, I'm not just talking about same-sex parented families, but also about what family means, how it's defined, how it's made among all people of diverse sexualities and genders. Whether in extended biological families with a small or a large dash of queerness, in blended or other unconventional family formations, including chosen relationships of intimacy and affinity, our ways of doing family life are queerer than ever, in Australia and around the world. Yes, lots of LGBTQ people are having families, but they also all come from families and in turn are forming families in all kinds of new arrangements. And we need to talk about that more because when we see queer families as unusual, we don't recognise that diversity as woven into the very fabric of Australian family life and as something that we are all responsible for tending to with care. Instead, we leave it up to the individuals who are strong and resourced enough to take on that role themselves. I want to give you an example from the Queer Generation study. This study was led by Peter Aggleton with a wonderful team from around Australia, Mary Lou Rasmussen, Rob Cover, Daniel Marshall in particular, in which we interviewed people who were born in the 1970s or born in the 1990s about growing up queer in regional and urban Australia. The participants came from every walk of life, incredibly diverse cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds, and described a range of experiences of navigating the complex trajectory from childhood through adult life as a gender or sexually diverse person. While some of their experiences were very difficult and some were really quite smooth, most of their stories of family life were a mix of adversity and belonging. So I've got an example here from an interview with a man called Sebastian, which is a pseudonym. He's a gay man in his 40s who grew up in a conservative and religious migrant family in Sydney. And I'll read a longer quote. There's some examples on the slide. "I'm the only out person in my family that I know of. I've got 5 nephews and they're great. I love them to bits. And I don't think they know anyone else that's gay. So for me, I try to be the best gay guy I can be. It's a privilege though, because although my parents sort of disowned me when I came out at 18, I don't blame them. I blame their ignorance. I was telling my mum this. I go, if you think it was very difficult for you to accept I was gay, can you imagine how hard it was for me to actually look in the mirror and say, this is who I am? And to have the courage to come out to a Roman Catholic family, a Latino family, mind you, growing up in Western Sydney, to sort of say, I'm sorry if this offends you, but it's not my issue, this is your issue. And even though I was homeless and I faced many challenges in my life, I go, this was me and my journey into teaching my parents about my life. I think Sebastian is incredible in remaining connected to his family despite this experience. And while it is a good news story to know that families can and do repair, it shouldn't be up to people like Sebastian to take on this responsibility for educating his family. The time has come, surely, for our political, educational and community leaders to be doing that work. They need to be setting an agenda that makes it clear accepting difference is the responsibility of every Australian. And as part of that broader message, they also need to make clear that queer families are not only everywhere, but they are also all different from each other. They are not one thing, and this is okay. Sebastian should not have to be the very best gay role model he can be in order for his loved ones to believe that queer life can hold value. This kind of conditional acceptance goes to the heart of what was most humiliating about the Marriage Equality Survey, realising that for a still too large number of Australians, not even the best looking, most stable and least troubling of same-sex attracted men and women were seen to be worthy of the same rights as their heterosexual cisgendered peers. Then what hope for the rest of us? Because not all people in the queer community are going to do homonormativity successfully, and many do not want to. This is a genuinely diverse collection of people. Some are involved in committed relationships, others manage their sexual and romantic lives in far less traditional configurations. Some are religious and conservative even, others absolutely not. They live across the broadest reaches of our cultures, classes and communities, and I hope that we can move forward now in simply accepting this as fact so we can start having more robust conversations about the realities and challenges of everyday life for every kind of family. My second point is that I hope we can come to understand that queer families, like all families, are both vital and largely unremarkable. Despite all of our progress in promoting acceptance of diverse sexualities, we can still become preoccupied with what may be different about queer families. And yet surely, most are simply trying their very best to deal with exactly the same kinds of issues that most other families prioritise. Juggling work and family life, managing relationship challenges and transitions, supporting children with a range of different needs, and trying as we might to all keep up with an increasingly digital, fragmented and precarious world. I hope we can get to a point very soon where we can speak openly about queer families without it being all that interesting a topic to anyone, conservatives or radicals. But this doesn't therefore mean that we shouldn't be interested in this topic at all. On the contrary, it is those unremarkable details that I want to hear more of. Because while we know that families are not safe places for everyone, some say for many, and they can be responsible for terrible harms, they can still play a very powerful role in providing care and support. Most of our work at CSRH uses social research methods to understand how people make sense of and attend to their health. And among the many, many LGBTQ identified people I've interviewed about this in my time at the centre, I've been particularly affected by stories about the supports that families, however they are defined, can provide in promoting the well-being of their queer kin, particularly in the context of what can be pretty ruthless, unchanging sometimes, it seems, forms of social stigma. We're currently interviewing people who've been diagnosed with a stigmatised bloodborne virus, HIV, hepatitis B or hepatitis C are the three we're looking at, to find out what family has meant to them in their journey through diagnosis, treatment and management, depending on their circumstances. We've also been interviewing family members, and we're still hoping to interview more, so please look up the My Health Our Family study if you are interested. But among the more than 40 participants we've interviewed so far, we've heard some really moving accounts of the role family can play in supporting people through what can be a very challenging and very isolating health experience. As brief explanation, because I realise not everybody here may have as detailed an understanding of the bloodborne virus sector as some of us do. HIV, hepatitis B and hepatitis C are all bloodborne viruses, but HIV is largely sexually transmitted in Australia. Hepatitis C is largely transmitted through the sharing of injection drug use equipment. Hepatitis B through mother-to-child transmission in overseas countries, as well as other routes. So HIV affects the immune system, hepatitis B and C affect the liver, all are very serious infections for your health over the long term. HIV can now be managed very effectively with treatment, bringing rates of sexual transmission to almost negligible. A relatively recently introduced class of treatments for hepatitis C has achieved much higher success rates and less side effects than previous options. Hepatitis B can be prevented with a vaccine. Treatment can manage the effects of the virus in the body over time, but there is no cure. Men who have sex with men are a priority group for vaccination for Hep B, just so you know. All three viruses carry a persistent social stigma, although we hope that is changing. I have one quote from one of the interviews in this study. It's from Damien, a gay man in his 50s who had cleared hepatitis C with one of the older forms of treatment before the more recent last 2 years of DAAs that we've had available. But he had a very difficult time through that treatment experience, and he told us about the role that family played in helping him through it. I told my brother because I realised I was going to need some support, and through a couple of rounds of treatment I was on the phone to him every couple of days. Although he's not my close family as my partner and my friends are, his loyalty is the most helpful thing, because I know that that will always be there. While we argue about other stuff, we never argue about how much we care for each other. I would think that a lot of people are hesitant to discuss their health, particularly with their families, even their partners in some cases, and I think that's really sad. Because if you have an honest relationship with family members, then those are the most important things you should be discussing with them. Those are the people that are most likely to understand and work in the wider world to break down stigma and discrimination, if they understand it from your situation. So I think people owe it to their families and owe it to the wider world to talk about their diagnosis and be really open and honest. Because not only does it make it better for them, it makes it better for everybody. At this point in history, we have legal protections in place for sexual minorities and for people affected by transmissible infections, although much more work is still needed in that area. Yet social stigma remains both towards these and other transmissible infections and towards people of different gender and sexual identities, manifesting across all areas of social life as homophobia, transphobia and other forms of discrimination. While successful treatment will ultimately help to calm the fears and prejudices which have persisted over these last few decades of our response to bloodborne viruses, as Damien says, not only can families provide important supports for loved ones, often in the most ordinary ways, families can also play an important role in challenging stigma. This reminds us that there can be multiple benefits of talking about difference within families, including serodifference. Not only can encouraging cultures of robust honesty bring people together in terms of support and connection, but it also means that families are granted the opportunity, which we very much hope they will take up, to take on some of the responsibility for informing themselves about sexuality and about how we might affirm our gender, about drug use, about the range of bloodborne and sexually transmissible infections which affect our communities. My third and final point about queer families is that we should be valuing their stories not only for what they reveal about living with difference, but also for how they help us rethink what we assume to be normal. Because there are some ways in which queer families look and live a little differently, whether through circumstances and constraints, or indeed through deliberate design, radical choice. I remember when I had my first child, some of the women in my mother's group had questions about how we arranged things in my home. They weren't being nosy, they just wanted to know if there was another way. Because even in homes where the mother is both childbearer and breadwinner, the organisation of parental and domestic responsibilities largely remains gendered. In my home, with 2 mums and no dad, we were constrained by far fewer of the social scripts which tended to shape their lives. So this is just one example of how queer families can help us to question our assumptions about gender and sexuality norms and to consider carefully whether or not they're working for us. But I think we can also learn much about what we assume to be normal by listening at a larger scale to those who've grown up with a sense of being different. I have one last quote to share, also from the Queer Generation study, this time from a lesbian woman who was in her 30s at the time of interview. She said, "When I told my mum I was gay, all she could say was, 'Okay, well, same rules apply then. When girls come over, you can't have the bedroom shut.'" So I was really lucky, and I've still got really good, supportive parents. But I grew up in a beach suburb, everyone with blonde hair, blue-eyed, long hair, while I was like a tomboy. I remember a party where I felt very out of place. When I left my house, I felt comfortable and I felt good, but I looked like a boy. And when I got to the party, I went, "Oh my God, I'm so different." As soon as I could get a job, I moved closer to the city, but I was still different then too. People would make comments, like people would say stuff in the supermarket, you know. I was lucky when I was about 19 to meet a gay guy that was a lot older and had been through a lot more. He'd say, "Just smile at them and say hello, just be friendly." I do it to this day. But I get worried about, now that I have a son, that a small part of the population will say, "Yeah, I don't mind the gays, but I still think every child should have a mum and a dad." It makes me nervous for him. As we can see in Susie's story, there is a generation of people living in this country now who are arguably the first to have a mostly positive experience of coming out to parents, and who may also be having children of their own. Yet this same generation is also keenly aware of how new these freedoms are, how much work it has taken to achieve them, and how fragile they remain. Their stories remind us that the social order we all live under is simply not safe for everyone. Queer-identified people and those who love them often know all too well that what we take for granted as normal, as everyday life, depends on the insistent and systematic exclusion of people who look or act differently. Queer families often live with a historical sense of feeling out of step with the surrounding culture and pervasive fears about how they and others who are different will be treated into the future. And although our research and that of others is revealing that younger people are becoming more accepting of sexual and gender differences, and families are generally also becoming more open-minded, we cannot assume that there is a one-directional force driving us towards greater acceptance and inclusion in this country. We also cannot assume that our young people are going to automatically do better at challenging gender and sexuality norms. Nor do we know that family environments will be the places for new and better ways of relating to emerge. Indeed, if younger people are more often remaining connected to their extended families when they come out, they may also be less likely to seek out queer community, which in some ways means a loss of opportunity to explore alternative ways of doing family life and questioning the norms which governed how we were each raised. I hope in moving forward that we can come to recognise with more honesty and compassion that we are all far more diverse, messy and interesting than will fit into the rainbow happy representation of inclusive Australian families that we had to prioritise to achieve marriage equality. We need those positive representations. They do help us to challenge our cultural understandings about what Australian families look like, but I'm more interested now in hearing the real stories. I want to hear the stories of same-sex separations and the new family configurations they enable, including single-parent households like my own. I want to hear the stories of pregnant trans guys and how they are securing a safe place within family, health and social service systems. the stories of family relationships for intersex people who lived through the trauma of unnecessary surgical intervention, and hopefully, increasingly, those who have not, who are simply living with what they and their families understand to be an intersex variation, one which ideally presents no medical or legal barrier to pursuing parenthood themselves if they so choose it. I'd like to hear more stories of Aboriginal families and migrant families and families with few socioeconomic and educational opportunities, or indeed families who are deeply invested in their faith, as the one I was raised in, but who have remained connected to their queer folk, overcoming their fears and prejudices in their own particular ways. It's these stories that our leaders need also to be listening to, learning from, and telling others about. To conclude, I want to acknowledge that my own family history is why I'm able to speak here today. It's a very white history, intersecting with many other forms of social privilege, but I'm also the first woman in the countless generations of women who came before me to really have a voice and the opportunity to make a contribution to public life. I hope they'd all be pleased to see me speaking my mind here today, even if the topic would likely be a little off colour for them. I'm also here because of all of those people who have been living in and creating queer families for generations and who are only now really coming into the public eye as both a vital and an unremarkable part of who we are as Australians. I'm honoured to play a small role in capturing their unfolding stories. These families, I believe, may not be some new and better model, but they still have much to teach us. Thank you.